The man known to history as Wilhelm Keitel was born on the 22nd of September 1882 at the Keitel family estate in Helmscherode near Gandersheim in the lower Harz Mountains of north-central Germany. His father was Karl Keitel, who, despite being a middle-class landowner in possession of a 650-acre estate at Helmscherode, struggled to make ends meet due to the poor soil quality and difficulty in managing his large tract of land. Wilhelm's mother, Apollonia Fissering, came from an old established family of tenant farmers in the Harz mountain region. Wilhelm would barely know her, however, as she died in childbirth while bringing his younger brother Bodewin into the world when Wilhelm was just 6 years old. The Keitel family had acquired their lands at Helmscherode in 1871. It was a significant date. This was the same year that the 30 or so small and medium-sized states which ruled Germany were united together into a German empire under the leadership of the most powerful German state, Prussia. This momentous event in Europe's political history was the work of the Prussian statesman Otto von Bismarck, following a series of wars against Austria, Denmark and France. The unification of Germany into a state which included much of what is now western and northern Poland created a behemoth in Central Europe, one which upset the balance of power across the continent. With its territorial, military, political and economic power, the new German Empire was a state which could challenge Europe's foremost power, Great Britain, and so it would. As Wilhelm was growing up in the 1880s and 1890s, Europe was dividing into two camps, one led by Germany, allied with the Empire of Austria-Hungary, and the other between France and Russia. Britain remained aloof for the time being, but it was the beginning of a long, slow drift towards a cataclysmic continental war. Wilhelm's early years did not involve much politics at all. The Keitels' interests were largely limited to agriculture, horses and hunting. What happened in Berlin largely only impacted them when it affected protective tariffs on agricultural activity. For his education, Wilhelm had a private tutor. He only proved an average student, although his teacher deemed him to be bright all the same. Later, he narrowly graduated from the Göttingen Gymnasium, something which concerned him little, as he believed his future lay with the family pursuits and that he would take over part of the Keitel farm in later years. Something changed in his late teenage years, however, and Wilhelm set his mind on a military career instead. This was perhaps a sign of the times, as Europe's armies were increasing in size and nations sought to swallow up what parts of the world outside of Europe were not occupied by them already. Wilhelm's decision to join the Prussian military, which still maintained a distinct identity within the German Empire, was perhaps doubly surprising, for the one constant of the Keitel family's politics was its dislike of Prussian dominance of the federal German Empire, a background which would set him apart from many of his fellow officers in the German army in years to come. In 1901, Wilhelm joined the 46th Prussian Field Artillery Regiment near Brunswick, not far from home. Because of his middle-class background, he was quickly made a junior officer, and he soon proved himself by his intelligence and efficiency. He was serving as a second lieutenant, and his superiors had noted his disposition for making good organizational and tactical decisions, a vital trait in an effective commander. As a result, he was promoted again to a staff captain in the late 1900s, when he was still just in his mid-20s. He also married at this time. In 1909, he was wedded to Lisa Fontaine, the daughter of an affluent farmer whose lands were not far from Hanover in northern Germany. The union was something of a meeting of opposites. Lisa was cultured, well-read, and fond of music. Wilhelm was a much more dour character, of whom long-term acquaintances noted that he had probably never read a book that didn't concern military tactics or the history of warfare. They welcomed their first child, a girl they named Nonna, in 1911, followed by several more, including 3 boys, Karl-Heinz, Ernst, and Hans-Georg, who would all follow their father into the German military. Wilhelm's life, like that of millions of other Europeans, altered dramatically in the 1910s. Between 1910 and 1914, a series of regional crises had arisen across the continent and in parts of Africa such as Morocco, each of which had threatened to turn the long-simmering tensions between Europe's powers into a full-blown war. By this time, Britain had thrown in its lot with France and Russia, and the battle lines were fairly clearly drawn, with these countries on one side and the combined forces of Germany and Austria-Hungary on the other. The Balkans in particular had proved a volatile area following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire's control in the region. The new states that emerged vied with each other, with Austria-Hungary and with Russia, for control of the territory. Two small-scale wars occurred here in the early 1910s, but what really ignited tensions was the murder of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, on the streets of Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914 by a Serb nationalist. A regional conflict developed in the weeks that followed between Austria-Hungary, Serbia, and Russia, and this escalated by late July to include Germany, France, and Britain. With negotiations failing, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on the 28th of July 1914, following which Europe's powers each declared war on each other. By the 4th of August, Germany and Austria-Hungary were at war with Britain, France, and Russia. With the commencement of the First World War in the months that followed, Keitel was deployed with the 46th Artillery to Flanders in Belgium, which Germany had invaded in order to provide a route into northeastern France. Most of the fighting on the Western Front between the Germans and the French and British would take place in this region of France over the next 4 years, in a large strip of land between Paris and the Belgian border. Keitel, though, did not see much action at the beginning. Not long after he arrived on the Western Front, he was injured in his right arm in a shrapnel explosion in September 1914. However, he soon recovered, and when he did, he was appointed to the General Staff of the German military. His superiors had been told about his exceptional organizational abilities and brought Keitel into the central planning on the Western Front. His promotion was also based on his background in the artillery. As the war became a largely static conflict between armies dug into underground trenches in northeastern France, artillery became the primary mode of striking the enemy through intense barrages before a forward movement from the trenches. It is unsurprising, then, to learn that many of those who were promoted within the German military during the First World War came from the artillery regiments. Artillery, or any other weapon, could not win the war for Germany, though its military was more effective than that of Britain, France, or Russia throughout the course of the war. The problem was a purely mathematical and logistical one. Germany had fewer soldiers to fall back on, and was completely outnumbered once the United States joined the war on Britain and France's side in 1917. Moreover, the German economy was falling drastically short on core goods which it needed to sustain the war effort. Unrest, both within the armed forces and amongst the civilian population back home in Germany, eventually brought the war to an end before the Germans were fully defeated on the battlefield. After a series of uprisings in Germany in early November 1918, the Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated, bringing the German Empire to an end. 2 days later, an armistice was signed, signaling the end of the First World War. The peace agreements in the 2 years that followed, notably the Treaty of Versailles, effectively stripped Germany of much of its territory to create a newly independent Poland, and imposed huge war reparations on the country. Most significantly for Keitel, the German Republic was required to demobilize most of its armed forces and keep its army at a size which would ensure it posed no further threat to Britain and France in years to come. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and officers who would have wished to remain in the military were demobilized in 1919 and 1920, creating a huge number of disillusioned young and middle-aged German men who began joining paramilitary organizations in Germany in the early 1920s. Their resentments at Germany's post-war position and their own roles within it would be fostered by other embittered individuals, with terrible consequences for Germany and Europe in the long run. Keitel was not amongst them. In the closing stages of the war, he had received successive promotions to become the first General Staff Officer of a reserve infantry division and then the same commanding position of one of the Marine Corps stationed in Flanders. There he made the acquaintance of some of the most senior commanders in the German military, and as a result, he was included amongst the 100,000 individuals that the new German government was allowed to keep as part of its professional army under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Thus, after briefly considering retiring back to the family estate at Helmscherode, Keitel joined the scaled-back army of the new Weimar Republic, so named for the town of Weimar, where its assembly had first convened. The terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which related to German demobilization and disarmament, were extremely restrictive. For instance, the new limited German military force named the Reichswehr, meaning Reich Defense, was not permitted to possess the tanks that had been developed during the First World War, nor was it allowed to have an air force. Artillery was allowed, but only with ordnance which was capable of firing small 10.5 caliber shells. Moreover, the troops' numbers were, as noted, limited to 100,000 men, while the General Staff, the officer corps which had run the war for Germany, were prohibited. Consequently, Keitel and many other officers in the Reichswehr were charged throughout the early 1920s by the new Chief of Staff, General Hans von Seeckt, with finding ways around these regulations. Former members of the General Staff, such as Keitel, were, for instance, simply reclassed as officers of a new Truppenamt, or troop office. Keitel would serve as a colonel and branch chief within the Truppenamt until 1933. Throughout this time, von Seeckt had commanders like Keitel arrange their units in such a way that for every one man officially recorded as a soldier in the Reichswehr, there were two others who were unofficially trained and could be quickly mobilized if needed. As a result, the Reichswehr throughout the 1920s generally had 3 times more men than was allowed under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. While Keitel and his fellow officers were trying to push the limits of the Treaty of Versailles as far as they could during the 1920s, the wider politics of Germany was going through many changes. In the early 1920s, there had been huge discontent amongst large sections of the population at how the war ended, and particularly, as noted earlier, amongst young and middle-aged men who had been in the military. Many of these joined the paramilitary units such as the Freikorps or Freikorps following the war, and veteran clubs such as the Stahlhelms, so named after the pointed helmet German soldiers had worn during the war. In time, many of these individuals began drifting towards extremist political parties. One of these, based out of Munich in Bavaria, was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party for short. By 1923, they were largely led by an Austrian demagogue by the name of Adolf Hitler, who had fought and been wounded in the war. In early November 1923, they even attempted a regional coup or putsch in Munich. It collapsed within hours, and Hitler was subsequently arrested, tried, and sentenced to several years in prison. But the very fact that it was attempted was a sign of simmering resentments amongst subsections of the German population at the post-war settlement. The mid-1920s brought greater stability to Germany's politics. The country was beginning to reap the fruits of the post-war economic boom, which led to the period becoming known as the Roaring Twenties. Jazz was heard in every city's music halls. People often saw their first silent films at a picture theater, and German Expressionism, with its thriving heart in Berlin, became the foremost cultural movement in the world during the 1920s. But this would not last. In the autumn of 1929, the stock markets on Wall Street in New York City took enormous losses as the world's economy cooled dramatically after years of growth. A Great Depression followed, and Germany's economy was hit particularly badly. Unemployment lines increased in size, and soon people began to run out of money. The wealthier in society soon had their life savings eviscerated by rampant inflation. As this occurred, the centrist parties which had controlled the Weimar Republic throughout the 1920s soon lost ground to more extreme groups. On the left, the communists had increasing support, while the Nazis were the primary beneficiary on the right. In the Reichstag elections in the summer of 1932, they won 37% of the vote, taking 230 seats in the 608-seat parliament. The centrist elements within government remained determined to exclude them from power. But how long could that last? During these years, Keitel was continuing to serve in a wide variety of roles within the German armed forces. A notable assignment came in 1931 when he was sent to Moscow. The German government had established an arrangement with the government of Joseph Stalin in the Communist Soviet Union during the 1920s, whereby the officers of the Red Army were advised by the German officers who remained in the Reichswehr, largely deemed to be the best tactical commanders in the world. In return, the Red Army allowed the Germans to train soldiers in Russia, so they would not be officially listed as forming part of the sanctioned 100,000-strong Reichswehr back in Germany. During his secondment here in 1931, Keitel was impressed by the extent of the Soviet Empire and the size of the Red Army. It was probably at this time that his belief that Germany should never go to war was developed. But this period also brought some health problems. Keitel, who was nearing his 50th year, ignored an inflamed vein in his leg while in Russia, and it deteriorated so much over the months that followed that it developed into severe thrombosis. As a result, in December 1932, he and his wife traveled to a spa at High Tatra in Czechoslovakia for rest and recuperation, a stint which extended into early 1933. It was while Keitel was away from Germany on this period of leave that he learned of a rapid shift in the German political situation. After a failed minority government headed by Franz von Papen as Chancellor and a new election just months after the earlier one in the summer of 1932, the deadlock had still not been broken in Berlin. Therefore, in January 1933, a coalition of individuals including von Papen and the heads of the German business community had convinced the German president Paul von Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as German Chancellor in a coalition government of other centrist and right-leaning parties. The centrists believed they could control Hitler, and by bringing him into the government, they would also be able to stop any further rise of the left-leaning parties such as the Communists. They were immensely wrong in this judgment. Within weeks, a new election was called in which the Nazis used intimidation to increase their vote share and number of seats. Then, a fire at the Reichstag was blamed on communist subversives and used to argue the necessity of passing an enabling act which allowed the Nazis to rule by decree. The passage of the act on the 23rd of March 1933 spelt the end of the Weimar Republic and the inception of Nazi Germany. Keitel was not an individual one would automatically have earmarked for promotion within this new dispensation. Politically, he favored von Papen and was wary of the Nazis. Nevertheless, they were now in charge of the German state, within the army of which Keitel was a commander. However, the Nazis did not immediately gain full control over the military. Rather, they began rearming, but allowed the German officer class to maintain a degree of independence throughout much of the 1930s. A change of personnel did occur at the very top, with General Werner von Blomberg, the chief of the Truppenamt, now promoted to become the Minister of Defense within the new regime and effectively placed in charge of Germany's armed forces. Von Blomberg and Keitel were old acquaintances, having first served together in the First World War. Accordingly, despite his own reservations about the Nazis, Keitel was soon promoted. On the 1st of October 1933, he was made a Major General and infantry leader stationed at the city of Potsdam, while a year later he was entrusted with overseeing the formation of a new infantry division based out of Bremen in northern Germany, as part of the Nazis' immediate drive to exceed the quotas and restrictions imposed on the German army under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. A major concern of Keitel's at this point, and one that was shared by many other senior officers within the German armed forces in 1933 and 1934, was that the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party, the Sturmabteilung or SA, headed by Ernst Röhm, would try to effectively take over the German army or supersede it. By 1934, the SA had grown to 2 million men, and if it was merged with the German armed forces, old career officers like Keitel would be dwarfed by the SA commanders. However, Hitler had other ideas. Fearing Röhm's growing power himself, on the 30th of June 1934, a series of attacks known as the Night of the Long Knives commenced, whereby the SA leadership was deconstructed, Rome was killed, and the SA was largely neutralized as a threat to either Hitler or the German armed forces. Thereafter, its numbers reduced by 40% during the 1930s, and it lost ground politically as a paramilitary group to Heinrich Himmler's SS. The official German army was further strengthened with an announcement on the 16th of March 1935 that it was to rearm, not by exceeding the official 100,000-man cap, but by conscripting soldiers who would be trained, but not employed as career soldiers. It was a technical way of getting around the restrictions, one which mirrored some of the methods employed in the 1920s. In the meantime, Keitel's own personal views on Hitler and the Nazis had shifted. This was not simply owing to the decisive manner in which the Nazi leader had clipped the wings of the SA in 1934, but also to Keitel's first personal meeting with the German Chancellor. Keitel met Hitler at a conference of Nazi leaders and army officers at Bad Reichenhall late in 1933, where they had a brief conversation. Fleeting as it was, this minor meeting seems to have left quite an impression on Keitel. There is no clear way of explaining this. Many other senior members of the Nazi regime recorded a similar enthrallment upon their first encounter with the Nazi leader, but there is often little way of knowing whether this was the actual case or whether individuals such as Keitel used it later as a means of deflecting from their actions between 1933 and 1945. Whatever the explanation for it was, thereafter Keitel became a committed adherent of the Nazi cause. In 1935, a major change occurred in the management of the German armed forces which had considerable implications for the remainder of Keitel's life. On the 21st of May that year, the Reichswehr, the armed force which had been created in the aftermath of the First World War, was rebranded and reorganized into the Wehrmacht, meaning the defense force. Its name was misleading, for this marks a significant moment in Germany's military expansion towards an aggressive war. When Hitler announced its creation, he touted that it would have 36 divisions, a number which would have exceeded the 100,000 cap imposed under Versailles by fivefold at least. Then, in December, General Ludwig Beck added 48 tank battalions to the prescribed build-up, and these measures, combined with Hermann Göring's establishment of a German air force called the Luftwaffe from the spring of 1935, made it clear that Germany was now rearming in contravention of the Treaty of Versailles. Moreover, as the organizational body which would have central oversight of the armed land forces or Heer, the Air Force, the tank battalions, and the Navy or Kriegsmarine, the Wehrmacht would be the central organization involved in overseeing Germany's rearmament in the coming years, a process which Hitler initially wanted completed in a decade and then scaled back to as little as 4 years. The new Wehrmacht was headed by General von Blomberg, whose ministerial title was also now changed from Minister of Defense to Minister of War. However, the organizational running of the Wehrmacht would be placed in another individual's hands. The man von Blomberg recommended to Hitler was Wilhelm Keitel. The proposal was seconded by General Werner von Fritsch, the commander-in-chief of the German land forces. But Keitel was initially unhappy. While this was certainly a promotion, it would be a return to a desk job in Berlin as an administrator, whereas he had enjoyed his time in charge of infantry divisions at Potsdam and Bremen. Despite these reservations, and at the urging of his wife, Lisa, who wished to return to Berlin, he accepted the position and was appointed as chief of the Wehrmacht, junior only to von Blomberg within it and effectively in charge of the day-to-day running of the body which had overall oversight of all branches of the German military. In tandem, he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant general on New Year's Day 1936, shortly after taking up the new position in Berlin. Keitel's task was an arduous one. When he assumed office in October 1935, his predecessor as the most senior bureaucrat of the German military, Major General Walter von Reichenau, had met him wearing his tennis gear and handed him a dossier of what he said were the most vital documents he would need. Then von Reichenau went to play tennis, and Keitel was left in charge of administering a rapidly expanding Wehrmacht. Yet the chief problem he faced was not the paperwork itself, but the conflicting jurisdictions of individuals within the various organizations which the Wehrmacht oversaw. For instance, as head of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring was theoretically Keitel's junior, to whom Keitel could issue directives. But Göring was simultaneously the deputy leader of Germany as Hitler's second-in-command. As a result, it was difficult for Keitel to issue him with commands, and impossible for him to impose them if Göring decided he did not want to comply. Similar overlapping jurisdictions made his job difficult, notably with General von Fritsch, who believed that the German land forces should run their own affairs without any operational oversight. This problem was compounded by Hitler's unwillingness to intervene, as he was convinced that competition between his ministers and generals was an effective way of avoiding anyone becoming too powerful. Despite these limitations, the German armed forces continued to grow at pace in the course of 1936 and 1937. By 1938, the 36 divisions which Hitler had proclaimed would be recruited and trained in 1935 had become a reality, and the land forces of the Nazi state had risen to 600,000 men from the cap of 100,000 a few years earlier. Hundreds of German panzer tanks were being produced, and the Luftwaffe had grown to over 1,000 operational aircraft, consisting of a mixture of bombers and fighters, while the Kriegsmarine was constructing new U-boat submarines and had begun construction in 1936 of two enormous battleships intended to be the largest military boats afloat in the world, the Bismarck and the Tirpitz. Keitel was the man at the top of all this activity. From his office in Berlin, he oversaw staff members who ensured resources were directed to the shipyards and airfields to construct ships and planes, while the Wehrmacht's central offices were also charged with overseeing details regarding bullets and artillery ordnance. Effectively, Keitel was the logistician who oversaw the nuts and bolts of German rearmament between 1935 and 1939 in the run-up to the Second World War. A major development impacted Keitel early in 1938. For all that Hitler and the Nazis controlled the German state, the military had always maintained a level of independence, with von Blomberg and von Fritsch willing to push back on commands from the Nazi leadership. As the impending war neared, Hitler wished to remove these two. A perfect opportunity presented itself in early 1938. On the 12th of January that year, von Blomberg, whose wife had passed away some years earlier, remarried to Erna Grün. Within days, the Berlin police had obtained information that Grün possessed a long criminal record and had once posed for pornographic photographs, as well as being arrested on charges of prostitution years earlier. This was deemed unacceptable for a minister and the commander of the Wehrmacht, and von Blomberg was asked to annul the marriage by Hitler. Von Blomberg refused and instead resigned on the 27th of January. These events inspired Göring and Himmler to concoct allegations of homosexuality, which was illegal in Nazi Germany, against von Fritsch, who was an unmarried bachelor. Following this, von Fritsch was also removed as head of the German land forces in early February, completing the removal of the two figures Hitler had become to view as impediments to a more aggressive German military buildup. The Blomberg-Fritsch affair led to a shaking up of the command structure of the German military. Keitel had played a central role in bringing to light the revelations about von Blomberg's new wife, and he was increasingly in favor with Hitler. He had already begun to earn the reputation of a biddable yes-man, which would come to define him in subsequent years. Therefore, it was he who was chosen to succeed von Blomberg in the aftermath of the affair. Hitler took over direct control of the Wehrmacht himself in anticipation of the impending war, but Keitel remained as head of the organizational wing and succeeded von Blomberg as war minister in all but name. He was not given a ministerial rank, but was appointed to the government cabinet as de facto war minister. Hitler is deemed to have wanted Keitel for the job because he was advised that he was an efficient bureaucrat who would not seek to prevent Hitler from calling the shots with regards to the Wehrmacht. For his part, Keitel was also made a colonel general shortly afterwards and was awarded the Nazi Golden Party Badge, a distinction usually awarded to individuals who had been party members back in the mid-1920s, when Hitler and his followers were little more than a small collection of disaffected misfits living in Bavaria. All of this was occurring as the drift to war was accelerating. The rearmament of Germany had been followed by the remilitarization of the Rhineland in March 1936, but thereafter German aggression had been rather limited. It quickly accelerated early in 1938 as pressure was applied on Austria internally to build support for a union with Germany. The Austrian government had faced pressure from Austrian Nazis operating from just over the border in southern Germany since 1933. But by early 1938, the pressure for unification was so strong that a referendum was declared on the matter. Hitler preempted the result by moving German troops into Austria before the vote was held, and it passed overwhelmingly thereafter, following which Austria was subsumed into a Greater Germany in March 1938. Thereafter, pressure was building for Germany to be allowed to annex the Sudetenland in western Czechoslovakia, which had a large ethnically German population. Britain and France caved to these demands in the autumn of 1938, but this did not stop Hitler from effectively annexing the remainder of Czechoslovakia anyway in the spring of 1939. This was the final act of appeasement, and it was now being made clear to Berlin that if the Nazis moved against Poland, as they proposed, there would be a war. As all of this was occurring, Keitel was overloaded with work. Hitler was a hard taskmaster, doubly so when he determined that Keitel would always make himself available at any hour of the day. It was not uncommon for the chief bureaucrat of the Wehrmacht to receive phone calls at home at night from Hitler about various operational matters. Moreover, as chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht or OKW and the de facto Minister of War, Keitel was also expected to appear at many social events in Berlin, which further stripped him of his time. All of this was compounded by a lack of strategic planning about the expansion of the army from early 1938 onwards. For instance, when the German land forces moved into Austria in the spring of that year, Keitel was somewhat horrified to discover there had been no prior strategy for how all of this would be organized through his office. He was simply expected to make it up as events unfolded. This process repeated itself many times in the years that followed, but Keitel never complained. He remained timidly loyal to the Chancellor and had become known as La Keitel, a play on Lackey and Keitel. It was all a thankless challenge for him, and quite revealingly, there is no evidence of anybody ever trying to displace Keitel or coveting his office as chief of the OKW. The first steps that would lead to Keitel being implicated in war crimes were also beginning at this time. It seems to have taken the head of the Wehrmacht aback when, in the lead-up to the intervention in Czechoslovakia in March 1939, Hitler mused that if the Czechs were to kill the German ambassador in Prague, it would provide a good justification for intervention in the country. The import of the statement was clear. Hitler was considering having Germany's own ambassador to Czechoslovakia killed as an excuse for intervening in the country. Events like this and many others would later form the basis for charges that Keitel had been directly involved in fomenting war in Europe. Yet, there were other more glaring developments. The Nazis had always been rabidly anti-Semitic and, shortly after coming to power, had introduced the Nuremberg laws, pieces of legislation that effectively disenfranchised Germany's Jewish people. Now, on the night of the 9th of November 1938, pogroms occurred all across Germany as gangs of Nazis and other Germans attacked thousands of German Jews and their businesses, murdering many, injuring many more, and doing untold amounts of damage to Jewish synagogues and property. It's difficult to tell what Keitel made of all of this in 1938, but years later he would become complicit in the Nazi state's anti-Semitism when it took an ever more sinister turn. The war, which had been brewing for nearly 2 years, finally came in September 1939. For months, Germany had been making noise on the international stage about its supposed rights to parts of Western Poland, in the same way it had with Austria and Czechoslovakia in 1938. This time, Britain and France were clear that there would be no concessions. However, they were caught unawares when, in late August 1939, news broke of a major diplomatic agreement between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Fascism and communism were ideologically opposed, and yet a non-aggression pact had been worked out with secret clauses allowing for Berlin and Moscow to effectively carve up the lands between their nations in Eastern Europe between them. Russia would take much of the Baltic states and some of Poland, while Germany would take the bulk of Poland. A few days later, a false flag operation was conducted on the German-Polish border to make it seem that the Poles had been the aggressor. There probably was no need for this latter act, as nobody was fooled. When Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, in retaliation for this concocted act of hostility, both Britain and France responded by declaring war on Germany 2 days later. The Second World War had commenced. 2 days prior to the invasion of Poland, Keitel was appointed by Hitler to the Council of Ministers for the Defense of the Reich. This was a 6-man committee which has been viewed by some as a species of war cabinet. In addition to Keitel, it consisted of Hermann Göring, who chaired the council and was head of both the Luftwaffe and the war economy, Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer to Hitler in the Nazi Party, Wilhelm Frick, the Minister of the Interior, Walter Funk, the Minister for Economic Affairs, and Hans Lammer, the chief of the Reich Chancellery, who would act as Hitler's representative on the council. Within this was a smaller subcommittee consisting of Göring, Keitel, and Frick, which could issue decrees. There has been widespread debate as to how much authority the Council of Ministers for the Defense of the Reich actually had. It certainly could and did oversee many matters relating to the production of war material and other logistical issues, but it would be untrue to claim that it had any major decision-making role in the strategic planning of the war. Once the Second World War broke out, Hitler was in charge of it, and the decisions were made by him and whichever generals, ministers, and officials he chose to consult with at a given time. Initially, the war went exceptionally well for Germany. Poland was conquered in a matter of weeks in September 1939. Then, after a winter of consolidation, in the spring of 1940, Denmark and Norway were occupied in 2 targeted campaigns, placing Germany in a strong position in the North Atlantic. With this done, in early May 1940, the German armed forces steamrolled through the Low Countries for the second time in 26 years to invade France. A campaign spearheaded by the German panzer tank divisions quickly captured Paris and pushed the British Expeditionary Force to the north coast around Dunkirk, from where they just managed to pull off a daring naval retreat to Britain. Even with this limited success, Britain stood alone by the end of June 1940 against Germany in Western Europe, and Nazi flags were flying over capital cities from Paris to Warsaw. Keitel oversaw the armistice negotiations with the French that summer, which resulted in the creation of a puppet state that governed southern France for the duration of the war. All of these conquests seem to have deeply impressed Keitel, who was now rumored to have proclaimed that Hitler was the greatest general of all time. That assertion would be tested and proved profoundly wrong in the years that followed. Keitel was rewarded by Hitler in the aftermath of the conquest of Western Europe. He was promoted to the rank of Field Marshal on the 19th of July 1940. At the same time, he was provided with an endowment of 100,000 Reichsmarks, a huge sum which he seems to have been embarrassed by. He deposited the money in a bank account and never went near it, claiming that one was typically not made a field marshal after years of filling out paperwork at a desk. But there were also some changes which seemed to undermine his position in the summer of 1940. It was at this time that Dr. Fritz Todt was placed in charge of a new Ministry of War Production, with responsibility for manufacturing war material and armaments. This was a core remit of Keitel's office and could have been viewed as a snub to the office of the OKW, but from a practical perspective made sense in terms of the ever-growing mountain of responsibilities which Keitel had foisted upon him. In the summer of 1940, Keitel was also drafted into planning for a proposed German invasion of Russia. The Nazis had long viewed the Bolshevik communists of the Soviet Union as their ideological enemies, and the treaty they had agreed to in 1939 was nothing more than a temporary marriage of convenience between the two nations. Thus, a conference was held on the 31st of July 1940, just weeks after the conclusion of hostilities in Western Europe, where Hitler consulted with Germany's senior military commanders about how an invasion of Russia could be launched and what the probability of success would be. Keitel was included along with others such as Alfred Jodl, Keitel's close associate in the OKW, and Erich Raeder, the head of the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine. At the meeting, they generally protested, arguing that German military capacity could not match Russia's at full strength, and that any proposed invasion should certainly wait until Britain had been conquered or brought to accept terms. Despite their reservations, they were commanded to report back to Hitler on the logistics involved. The report that was produced pointed towards difficulties that Germany would face in continuing to obtain supplies of vital war materials, such as rubber, once they declared war on the Soviet Union. Despite his general reservations about the feasibility of a German invasion of Russia, Keitel had these sections omitted from the report, claiming that Hitler would not want such negativity obstructing him. In the end, the invasion went ahead. In the summer of 1941, Germany initiated the largest land invasion ever undertaken in military history, sending hundreds of thousands of men into eastern Poland and the Ukraine towards Russia. As in Western Europe the previous year, Operation Barbarossa, as it had been codenamed, initially went very well. Through the August of 1941, the German front lines surged ever further northeastwards towards the two major targets of Leningrad and Moscow. The Soviet leader Joseph Stalin considered negotiating peace terms which would surrender huge tracts of land in Poland and Ukraine to Germany, but eventually determined not to. It was a wise decision in the long run. As winter set in, the German advance stalled before taking the two major Russian cities. Then, as it got ever colder, the Germans realized they had inadequate clothing for the harsh Russian winter. Keitel was centrally involved in the logistical work needed to remedy this situation in the weeks that followed. But in the end, it was not the cold but sheer manpower that would prove decisive. As 1941 turned into 1942, the Germans failed to end the conflict, and as ever more Russians were drafted into the Red Army and their war economy went into overdrive, the tide began to turn. When a final push by the Germans to take the southern city of Stalingrad failed the following autumn, the movement of soldiers switched direction, and slowly, from early 1943, the Russians began pushing the Germans back towards Berlin. Throughout these years, Keitel continued to act as the chief of the OKW, overseeing much of the logistical and organizational work of the Wehrmacht with his staff in Berlin. He was also regularly dispatched to capitals such as Budapest, Bucharest, and Helsinki to handle Germany's negotiations with its smaller military allies in Europe, such as Hungary, Romania, and Finland. By this time, he was increasingly unhappy with his position, remarking in his private notes that he wished to be relieved of his duties. Indeed, he had tried to resign on at least 3 occasions before the end of the war, but Hitler had refused to allow him to do so, despite the ever-growing frequency of their arguments. This interpersonal conflict was a regular feature of life for the senior German generals between 1941 and 1944. Ensconced in his Wolf's Lair, his base on the Eastern Front in Poland, Hitler was becoming an irrational, bitter individual, plagued by numerous serious physical ailments and a growing addiction to a combination of hard drugs including amphetamine, cocaine, and morphine. This was the individual that Keitel had to engage with throughout the remainder of the Second World War. Yet we should have little sympathy for him, for Keitel was also profoundly complicit in the ever-growing litany of war crimes and atrocities being committed by the Nazi regime. He had been fully aware, as early as the invasion of Poland in the autumn of 1939, of the actions of the Einsatzgruppen, effectively SS death squads, that were sent into areas after the initial advance to carry out the mass murder of groups who were deemed enemies of the Nazi state. In 1941, he would have known that their actions had escalated to such atrocities as the massacre at Babi Yar, where 33,771 Jewish victims were murdered in the space of 2 days. Other targets were Soviet prisoners of war, Romani people, or those with disabilities. And it wasn't simply that Keitel was aware of these activities, he was actively involved in them. In May 1941, he was a signatory to the order entitled Guidelines for the Conduct of the Troops in Russia, which designated Bolshevik civilians and Jewish people in Eastern Europe as groups whom ruthless measures could be used against. In September, Keitel issued a follow-up directive to ensure that these guidelines were being fully implemented, and in correspondence from these years, he seemed to exhibit a personal anti-Semitism beyond simply reflecting Nazi ideology. Just months later, Keitel was the central figure in the passage of the Night and Fog Decree in December 1941. This was executed through the office of the OKW, and Keitel was the main individual who communicated Hitler's directive. The decree stipulated that suspected political dissidents in occupied territories throughout Europe, such as France, Poland, and Austria, could be detained and transported to Germany. They could then be interred there and questioned according to military practice. The motive for this was to allow the deportation of individuals of certain nationalities, including from regions in France, the Low Countries, and elsewhere, where the Nazis were still trying to disguise what was being carried out in broad daylight in Eastern Europe. In practice, the Night and Fog Decree led to tens of thousands of political prisoners being detained across Central and Eastern Europe. Here, Europe's Jews and other groups such as the Romani people were being murdered by the Nazis by late 1941. In issuing the Night and Fog Decree in 1941, and an extension of it known as the Terror and Sabotage Decree in 1944, Keitel actively facilitated the work of the camps and increased the number of deaths that the regime was responsible for substantially. This drive to slaughter as many of the supposed enemies of the Nazi state as possible was taking place even as the war effort moved from military reversals on the Eastern Front in 1942 to a more fatal state. By early 1943, it was not simply the case that the Russians had begun to push the Germans back towards Poland and the Ukraine. The German Expeditionary Force in North Africa, which had been sent there to aid Germany's ally Italy, was also defeated that spring by the British and their new allies, the United States, who had entered the war in the closing weeks of 1941. Victory in North Africa was followed by the invasion of Sicily in Italy in the summer of 1943 by the Western Allies. Then, when the Italian government removed its fascist leader Benito Mussolini and attempted to negotiate peace terms with the Allies, Hitler committed further resources into establishing a breakaway Italian government in the north of Italy, headed by Mussolini, but which was effectively a German puppet state. And in the summer of 1944, the British, Americans, Canadians, and other Allied forces opened a Western Front in northern France. The conquest of France, which followed, was only slightly slower than the rapidity with which Germany had occupied it in 1941. And as the Russians moved west throughout Poland and the Ukraine, the situation was dire. By the opening weeks of 1945, the Russians were moving into eastern Germany as the Western Allies headed into the Rhineland. The result of the war was inevitable now, but it remained to be seen how the final chapter would play out. The worsening military situation did produce some limited resistance within Germany. Noteworthy in this respect was a plot which was hatched in the summer of 1944 by a group of German military commanders led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. This aimed to kill Hitler using a briefcase bomb left next to him during a meeting at the Wolf's Lair on the 20th of July 1944. The bomb detonated and injured nearly all of the 24 people in the room after Stauffenberg had left, but Hitler was not killed, as the conference table absorbed much of the blast before it struck him. Keitel was instrumental in the hours that followed in communicating with base commanders in Berlin and elsewhere to prevent Stauffenberg from initiating the second part of the plan to launch a coup in Berlin and then attempt to negotiate with the Allies. The plot was quickly suppressed as a result. Thereafter, Keitel sat on the military court, which was responsible for questioning hundreds of military officers in an effort to determine who had been involved with Stauffenberg. In the end, over 7,000 people were arrested and approximately 5,000 were executed, many of them after being tortured in order to determine how deep the plot ran within the military and civilian administration. The failure of the 20th of July plot ensured that Berlin would have to endure a bloody siege by the Allies. Hitler had no intention of surrendering, and all efforts to implore him to consider negotiations by other individuals were deemed borderline treasonous. Instead, old men and teenage boys were armed with guns to try to slow the Russian advance into Berlin, as Hitler spent his last days in the bunker of the Reichschancellery in the center of the city. The Battle of Berlin itself, once the Russians had encircled the city and cut off supply routes, commenced in mid-April 1945. The city was shelled relentlessly, and it was defended by anything but an effective army. But still, the Germans held out for over 2 weeks. Keitel bizarrely called for counterattacks during this period to push the Russians back, a tactical impossibility by this time. By the last days of April, it was clear that the end was near. In the end, Hitler committed suicide in the Reichschancellery bunker on the 30th of April 1945. The following day, his designated successor, the Reich Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels, did likewise. Berlin's garrison surrendered on the 2nd, and fighting in the capital of the Reich, which was meant to last 1,000 years, came to an end. It now just remained for the peace to be agreed. In the dying days of the Reich, many senior members of the regime and the military had begun leaving Berlin and headed toward northern Germany and the Danish border. The Allies had not occupied this part of Germany yet, due to the view of the British, Americans, and other Western allies that it was not strategically significant enough to warrant diverting forces northwards during their eastwards drive to Berlin. Thus, a government of sorts was established at the town of Flensburg near the German-Danish border at the beginning of May, after Hitler's and Goebbels' suicides in Berlin. This was headed by Karl Dönitz, the head of the Kriegsmarine, who briefly became President of Germany following Hitler's suicide. The Flensburg government had little purpose other than to officially bring the war to an end. Originally Keitel's close associate in the office of the OKW, Colonel General Alfred Jodl, signed the surrender of the German armed forces in the city of Reims in France on the 7th of May 1945. But after Joseph Stalin indicated his unwillingness to accept a German surrender to the Western Allies in France, when his country had borne the heaviest toll of the war, Keitel was sent to Berlin, where he signed the final instrument of surrender on the 8th of May, which became known as Victory in Europe Day. Perhaps the men at Flensburg, who had overseen the Nazi regime's reign of terror across Europe since 1939, wondered what would happen to them now. We know from accounts of the time and memoirs that some believed the Western Allies and the Soviet Union would quickly come to blows, and that Germany would be quickly rehabilitated once this next war began. Some were even deluded enough to believe that National Socialism in some form would survive in Germany. They were soon disabused of this notion. Keitel was one of the first to be arrested on the 13th of May, just 5 days after signing the surrender in Berlin on the orders of US military police. He was quickly moved to the Palace Hotel in Mondorf-les-Bains in Luxembourg, where he was soon joined by many of the other senior surviving members of the Nazi regime and the German military, notably Hermann Göring, the Reich Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, the leader of the general government which had ruled occupied Poland Hans Frank, and Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the SS commander who had governed the occupied Netherlands during the war. Here, these individuals were held captive in what was codenamed Camp Ashcan, until such time as the Allies were ready for them to stand trial. Keitel, Göring, Frank, Seyss-Inquart, and others such as the German Armaments Minister Albert Speer and Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the senior surviving member of the SS, went on trial in late 1945 in what was the most significant war crimes trial in the aftermath of the Second World War. As chief bureaucrat and organizer of the German armed forces and the de facto Minister for War between 1938 and 1945, it was undoubted that Keitel was going to be tried with these senior ministers. They were charged with a multiplicity of crimes, the most pivotal being fomenting war in Europe, committing war crimes and being cognizant of and involved in the creation and administering of the concentration camp system. These individuals stood trial for nearly an entire year at the city of Nuremberg between late 1945 and the autumn of 1946. It was difficult to find a German lawyer who would represent Keitel, who had chosen to plead not guilty. His defense throughout the proceedings was that, as a military officer, he was following the commands of his immediate superior, Hitler, throughout the war, a defense which the tribunal rejected on the basis that the crimes being committed in the concentration camps and elsewhere, which Keitel was aware of and complicit in, was so egregious that no command structure warranted obeying them. It was also explicitly noted that he had signed and overseen implementation of the Night and Fog Decree when he was sentenced. He was thus convicted and condemned to death. Keitel requested to be executed by firing squad, as a German military officer would typically be. This request was declined, however, on the basis that his actions were criminal, not military. Thus, he was to be hanged on the 16th of October 1946, just days after the trial concluded, along with others like Frank and Kaltenbrunner, who had been condemned to death. Goering committed suicide in his cell the night beforehand, and as a result, Keitel was the second executed after the foreign minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. The method used by the American executioners was a standard drop method whereby the prisoner would have a noose fitted around their neck and would then be dropped through a trap door. However, Keitel's execution was botched, and when he fell through the trap door, his face cracked against the edge of it, breaking his nose. Moreover, the American executioner John C. Woods had miscalculated the amount of rope needed for some of the prisoners, and as a result, several of those who were executed that day did not die quickly from having their necks broken, but were strangled to death. In Keitel's case, it was 24 minutes before his convulsions stopped fully. In later executions carried out after subsequent trials at Nuremberg, the method was changed so that there was no repeat of these botched executions. Once the executions ended on the 16th of October, Keitel and Goering's bodies and the bodies of the other 9 were cremated in Munich, and their ashes were scattered in the river Isar in southern Bavaria. Wilhelm Keitel is a difficult individual to assess as one of the most senior-ranking members of the Nazi regime. On the one hand, he appears to have been a powerful individual who was wholly complicit in the very many crimes committed by Nazi Germany. During the mid-1930s, he was responsible for overseeing the bureaucracy involved in German rearmament, while between 1938 and 1945, he was effectively the Minister for War and the head of the Wehrmacht, answerable only to Hitler. But at the same time, there is little escaping the feeling that Keitel was often a powerless functionary, an individual who handled mountains of paperwork and was deemed a lackey. This certainly was the opinion of many of the higher-ranking members of the regime and army, who often didn't bother to salute Keitel, their supposed superior. But however much these qualifications might suggest that Keitel was simply a military officer following commands blindly, he still had his own mind, however weak it might have been, and he was deeply involved on a personal level in facilitating the actions of the Einsatzgruppen on the Eastern Front and initiating the Night and Fog Decree. Given all this, the judgment of the Nuremberg Tribunal was surely correct, that no matter how much Keitel may have protested that he was simply following orders as a military officer, it was his duty as a human being to refuse to follow those orders. For that reason, he was a war criminal, just as surely as the others that he stood trial with at Nuremberg. What do you think of Wilhelm Keitel? Was he a mere sycophant and mindless bureaucrat, or should he be viewed as an influential figure within the Nazi regime? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.